Hi everyone, my name's Angela, this is Paperbacks Galore, and today I'm going to be reviewing a new release book. This is actually the first arc that I've ever read. I recently started working at Barnes& Noble, and booksellers get access to arcs, so I was able to pick up Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. I have a very small connection to this author because he was a lecturer at the university that I went to, and while he was teaching there, while I was in school, I actually saw him do a poetry reading, and ever since then I've always kind of been checking in on his career, and he's actually been a very, very successful poet. His poems have been in a lot of major publications. I believe he's won awards, and John Green himself has talked about how much he loves Kaveh's poetry, and he also blurbed this book. So this is Kaveh's debut novel, but he is already an established author, an established poet. Is that different from an author? Yeah. He's an established writer. That's what I meant. In Martyr, we follow a 20-something poet. He is Iranian American and he's living in Indiana. And Indiana kind of sucks. And I'm from there, so I know that it sucks. And he lives in this college town where he went to college. And the college in the book is Keedy University, which I believe is based on Purdue University, which is where Kaveh was a guest lecturer. And I have some little things that he says in the book that makes me think that, but that's not what's important here. Cyrus is a queer poet who struggles with depression. Both of his parents are deceased. He is an addict who's regularly going to AA meetings, and we are following him on a journey of trying to figure out meaning in life, basically. Cyrus has suicidal ideation, so major content warning for that. You can't really read this book without thinking about death and wanting to die and what death means. Even though Cyrus has suicidal ideation, he believes that death should mean something, and he's very interested in the topic of martyrs, hence the title Martyr. And throughout the book we get these excerpts of Cyrus, the character, actually writing poems about these martyrs in history. And so while he's just kind of working at his really weird job in this small town in Indiana, he gets this idea to write a book, perhaps a book of poetry, about martyrs. And he himself thinks that he might want to become a martyr. And he thinks it's really almost like shameful to die for nothing, which obviously is a belief that, is challenged throughout this novel, but he almost seems to scoff at the idea of just dying and that death having no meaning, whatever that means. And there's this really interesting line that I'll read out. This line has to do with like the overall plot of the book. So he says, the narrator says, Cyrus was beginning to realize that the world didn't actually work this way. That sometimes epiphany was as subtle as a friend showing you something they saw on Twitter. There's kind of a juxtaposition between Cyrus's like pretentious philosophical ideas about the world and about life and like what actually happens to him in this book. Like, I think he kind of romanticized the idea of getting an epiphany, and really it can just be his friend showing him something on Twitter, which happens in the book, and his friend shows him this performance art piece that's happening in Brooklyn, New York. There's this elderly, maybe not elderly, an older Iranian woman who is actively dying from cancer, who has decided to stop cancer treatment, only take pain meds, and she's actually living in this museum in Brooklyn and talking to people throughout the day, just like in this room in this museum, and it's her final art piece. And she has been a painter for many years of her life, and she's a really, really interesting character, and Cyrus is like, well, I have to go see her, like, this is fate, like, she's Iranian, I'm Iranian, she is literally almost being like a martyr to make her death mean something, at least that's what he thinks. And so he journeys from Indiana to New York to go talk to this artist. What I just described seems like a pretty linear plot, but what we actually get is also flashbacks and perspectives from Cyrus's deceased father, his deceased mother, his uncle who's still alive, and even this artist that he meets. So we are sometimes going back to previous decades. And so the story doesn't necessarily have, you know, a fast pace, which is fine. I don't think anyone really, expects that in literary fiction, but you are jumping around from perspective to perspective, from decade to decade. But Cyrus is really the heart of this novel. I remember when I was reading, thinking to myself that I was really surprised that there were chapters that weren't from Cyrus's perspective, because he is such the focus of this novel, and so much of his journey with mental illness and suicidal ideation and friendship and love and sex and all of these things. Like, he is such the lifeblood of this book. And I just thought it was an interesting choice to include all of these other perspectives from characters, but I think it was really well done, because at the end of the book, I was so glad that we got all of those other perspectives, because it all really mattered in the end. And I think sometimes in a book, if there's chapters that you had to read and you end up being like, why was that included? Why did the author make me read all of that? That can really like detract from the book. But in this case, it's the opposite. I was really, really glad to have learned about those characters with the detail that we learned about them. Obviously, there's a bit of an autobiographical nature to this novel as well, because the main character of this book, in theory, reflects a lot of Kaveh Akbar's lived experiences and identities. There is really, really honest and brutal and interesting commentary on addiction. There's really interesting queer representation in this novel. Obviously, we talk a lot about what it is like to be Iranian American and what it is like to be someone who Americans perceive as Muslim, even if you're not Muslim, and how Americans treat people like Cyrus. And there's also a good portion of this book that really makes you reflect on the atrocities that have been committed against brown people, Arab people since 9/11 and even before that, and just some of the, I don't want to spoil anything, but like some things in here mirror actual history, and I didn't even know about some of this history that was in this book, and it just made me so angry. And yeah, this book just explores so much, but a lot of it is not subtle. I think if you're a reader who wants to go into a book and like have to really parse through the text in order to find, the themes and meaning and try to like synthesize all of that by yourself, this is not necessarily going to be the book for you, because a lot of the it's a very quotable book. Like, if you read this, you need to have a pen in your hand to underline all of these great lines, but they're not very subtle. Does that make sense? Like, you're not necessarily on your own in this book. You're really being told everything pretty explicitly, which is fine, and I do think that there's some really, really fascinating lines in this book. Obviously, there's been a lot written about a lot of these topics like suicide and mental illness and addiction, but I found myself being really impressed by a lot of these lines. So I will say some people might find this book a bit heavy-handed, but I really enjoyed it. If you're wondering what kind of quotes in this book really made me just sit back in awe at how talented Kaveh Akbar is, he's talking about Cyrus's struggles with insomnia. People pretended to be asleep, trusting eventually their pretending would morph into the real thing. It was a lie you practiced nightly, or if not a lie, at least a performance. And while performance did not necessarily void sincerity, it certainly changed it. The speech you practiced in front of the mirror was always different than the one you ended up giving. Nothing else worked this way, insisting upon pretending. You don't sit in front of a plate of rice, pantomiming swallowing, in order to take the tiny grains into your stomach. Sleep alone demanded that embarrassing recital. Like, come on. It's just something that you read and you're like, I have to underline that. Like, I have to annotate that. Amazing. Obviously, writing style is a huge part of literary fiction, because you're pretty much not reading it for the plot, and writing style is a big part of what makes you love or hate a literary fiction. And I will say that Kaveh Akbar loves a simile, and I don't have a problem with similes, but I did kind of get bored by the repetition of similes in the same exact structure throughout the book, so I'll give you an example. The Shams men began their lives in America awake, unnaturally alert, like two windows with the blinds torn off. So it's like description of a thing, comma, like, and then, the simile. And he just does that, like, the simile is always at the end of the sentence, often at the end of a paragraph, and it just happened so often that I was like, can we do a metaphor? Can we put the simile like at the beginning of the sentence? So that got a little bit repetitive. However, there are so many incredible lines in this book, and even some plot stuff that I was not expecting that was just so compelling that I can really forgive that small annoyance. I ended up giving Martyr 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I will say literary fiction is not one of my favorite genres. I'd say it's kind of a middle tier genre in terms of enjoyment and how much I reach for it. I really enjoyed this. It was special to read this just because of the connection to Indiana, the connection to the college that I went to, the fact that I've seen Kaveh Akbar in a room reciting poetry, and I know kind of what his poetry is about, and seeing that translated into a novel format was really interesting. I didn't touch on the character work, but I think the character work was stellar. There is a tiny, tiny bit of romance in this book. It is not a romance book, so do not go into this thinking this is literary romance. It's not. But I found myself being like, Kaveh Akbar, can you please write a literary romance novel, please? Even if it's a sad one. I just want a whole book of a queer romance between two people, and that would be amazing. But obviously Kaveh Akbar is going to write whatever he wants to write, and I'm here for that. I would highly recommend this novel, especially if you like lit fic. I know some people hate lit fic, so if you hate lit fic, you're probably going to hate this. But if you like lit fic, I think you can really appreciate it. I believe this book comes out on January 23rd, but I've already seen it out in some stores and even in the library. So if you're interested, pick this one up and give it a try. Thank you so much for watching my channel, and hopefully some of this review made sense, and I hope you have a lovely week.